Well, hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Primary Care Podcast. It is your boy, Dr. Mark List, at you with another episode here on the Primary Care Pod. We have a joke today at the primarycarepod@gmail.com inbox, primarycarepod@gmail.com. That's where you can send us any jokes, any topics that you want us to hit on. Today, before we get into our topic, we have our joke today. All right, so Dr. List, what is the leading cause of dry skin? Ooh, good question. What is the leading cause of dry skin? Answer, towels. Oh, that was really, really, really dumb. Okay, let's unfortunately start the podcast.
The Primary Care Podcast is written and edited by a family physician for an audience of other physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, residents, medical students interested in primary care topics. This is not a podcast for patients and should not be used as medical advice. This is also a personal podcast, produced in my own time and solely reflecting my personal opinions. Statements of this podcast do not reflect the views and policies of my employer, past or present, or any other organization with which I may be affiliated.
Thank you for listening to the Primary Care Podcast. I'm Dr. Mark List, here to bring you the latest news, guidelines, and updates from primary care sources around the globe. Keeping it under 15 minutes long because you're in a hurry and I'm not that smart. Well, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back, friends, pod girls, pod boys, pod people, pod friends, to the Primary Care Pod. I am your podcasting host, Dr. Mark List. Today, it's an all-food episode of the Primary Care Podcast. How about that? We've never done this before. We're gonna talk about dietary topics that have come out recently. We're gonna look at the headlines. We're gonna dig into past the headlines, and we're gonna get into the studies themselves. Because, as you've heard me say on this podcast before, dietary science is an oxymoron. Dietary science, even though they do the best they can, dietary science is not a true science. It's none of these are, high quality evidence-based trials. They're all very, very weak evidence. They're very poorly. They're usually, interview trials. They're usually, a lot of kind of garbage associated with the trial. And yet people take them as gospel because everyone has their own food opinion about what diet it has to have. And there's entire, industries about diets and diet plans and don't eat this, choose my supplements, don't choose G's supplements. And as I always say, don't be a martyr when it comes to recommending dietary stuff. Have a couple of tools in your toolbox, know the basics, and then kind of go from there, right? Now, the two topics we're going to talk about today. This is the headline. 5 fruits and veggies a day may be optimal in terms of survival. This is from, let me pull this up. This is from actually Circulation, the Journal of Circulation, which is associated with the American Heart Association. And in this trial, they looked at a 30-year follow-up of 100,000 people. And this is the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals follow-up study. Okay, so the Nurses' Study has come out with a lot of information in terms of supplement usage and some other things. But again, it's important to note that these are questionnaires. So they ask these 100,000 people to regularly complete questionnaires, and then they continue this follow-up for 30 years. Now, in the course of this 100,000 people in this study, right, a third of the patients died. So we can then look back at their lives and say, well, were there some causes of higher rates of mortality, lower rates of mortality? And we get a lot of, good observational data from here. But again, it's hard to get randomized control trial with 30 years of follow-up. So this is a really, really, really valuable tool, but also, you have to take it with a grain of salt. Grain of salt, right? Okay. And when you look at the data here, and again, this is questionnaire-based data, they asked about how many fruits and vegetables do you take? And then they separate them out into quintiles, right? So 5 groups. The lowest group, the median servings of fruits and vegetables was about 2 servings a day. Okay, the next one was 3, next one was 4, next one was 5, and the highest quartile is actually 7 fruits and vegetable servings per day. And it gets really, really, really tricky because if you just look at the deaths per person years based on these quintiles, right, in the lowest fruit and vegetable intake, the incidence rate is 106 deaths per 10,000 patient years, basically, right? 10 to the fourth. That's 10,000, I believe, if my math is correct. Yes, it's 10,000. 10 to the fourth power. Google tells me that's 10,000. Yes, I was right. I should trust my instincts. Math is hard. Hashtag. Hashtags are hard. Hashtag. The highest quintile, so I said 106 deaths per 10,000 person years. The highest quintile, which had almost 3 times as many fruits and vegetables, had 107 deaths per 10,000 patient years. Right? So study over, right? Is that it? No. They have to do, just like with all dietary science, they do a ton of adjustments of their model, right? Because they don't randomize at baseline. They basically just take all comers. They ask them about these things, and then they have to apply all these models, right? So statistically, then you want to try and get these patients post-trial, organized into these groups so it makes sense, like you were randomizing them afterwards. And so their multivariable adjusted model shows that compared to the lowest quintile of Fruits and Vegetables Association, highest Fruits and Vegetables Association, really, the adjustment basically says there's a relative risk of mortality of 0.89, right? So an 11% reduction in mortality. Okay. Now, of course, that's relative risk, not absolute risk of 11% of mortality. If you actually do the math, and I did because, right, I'm a giant nerd bomber, the absolute risk reduction and therefore the number needed to treat. So for your entire life, for 30 years, you need to eat 7 fruits and vegetables per day, and 126 people need to do that for one person to have to prevent one death. Right, so the number needed to treat is 126 for fruits and vegetable from the 5th quintile down to the 1st quintile, right? So you can imagine, right, as we keep going down, we talk about specifically there's the other incidents were like cardiovascular mortality and some other outcomes that were associated with that. So not just right total mortality, but also cancer mortality, respiratory disease mortality, etc. So you can see this across the spectrum. Now, it seems though in all this data, right, when they analyze this data and they put on they do all their adjustments based on other alcohol use and smoking use and age and family history of all these things, and they run it through their multivariable adjusted model. Right? It seems like the benefits really cap out in that 4th quartile, which ends up being about 5 fruits and vegetables per day. And if you dig down deeper and they actually separate out all fruits and vegetables by just fruits, by vegetables, you can kind of predict that the biggest gains are in the 3 fruits per day. You see a significant benefit, and 2 vegetables per day. Right? So that's about the best, you need. Sorry, I got that backwards. 3 vegetables, okay, which was, again, 4th quintile, and 2 fruits, which, again, was about 4th quartile. You don't get any benefit after that, or at least in the studies, they didn't show a significant benefit after that. Now, not to throw the analogy in because it's a bad pun, but you have to take the study with a grain of salt because they don't adjust for any other things here, right? I mean, so they adjust for all these other models, right? But are the patients with the highest rates of, these higher quintiles of fruit and vegetable intakes, which are 7 plus compared to the 5 in the 4th quintile, are they vegan? Are they vegetarian? Are they just not taking in other things? Is that why there wasn't a continued decline of mortality? Or is there really just diminishing returns once you get past 5 per day? So when we educate patients, obviously fruits and vegetables are important, but I think this is nice that it's not a ton, and 3 vegetables, 2 fruits seems to be some kind of magic combination. But again, what kind of magic combination is it that you need to treat 126 people need to eat this compared to basically a fruit and a vegetable per day to get benefit, right? Shouldn't that just lead us all to eat junk food? So 125 of us will be exactly the same, but one sucker who didn't eat candy and junk food all day and ate their fruits and vegetables, that person will actually survive. So, I mean, I know that's not how it works out in general because it's associated with a bunch of other morbidity, but it's funny that the headline is 5 fruits and vegetables per day will make you live longer. with a number needed to treat of 126, right? And the thing about diet and exercise is they're free, they're easy, they're cheap. It's associated with a lot of health benefits, not just physical health, but also mental health and a ton of other things. But I think the dietary research, again, yeah, there's mortality benefit. But what does that mean? And how reliable is this? And how repeatable is this? And is this actually a real number, or is it just a product of the numbers? And it's the best research we have for diets, but it's still, again, this idea that we can figure out dietary science, it's just garbage. And so again, I'm going to keep talking about how, sure, I think any evidence is good to talk about, but again, I think we need to take it with a little bit of skepticism and a humility that we probably don't know everything that we need to know about this topic. But again, take-home point: fruits and vegetables good. There seem to be diminishing returns after about 5 or 3 vegetables, 2 fruits. But again, if you're somebody who's killing yourself to try to get 5 of those in per day, it probably isn't going to make a hill of beans difference. Oh man. Food puns. I have a bunch, but I don't know how many I'm going to throw in. I honestly don't. Okay, so the next title that I wanted to read, right, very similarly gets headlines: Association of Cereal Grain Intake with Cardiovascular Disease and Mortality Across 21 Countries in Prospective Urban and Rural Epidemiological Studies. The CURE studies, or the PURE studies, P-U-R-E, sorry, Prospective Urban and Rural Epidemiology Study. So it's a prospective cohort study that, again, looked at the association of intakes. Okay? So, again, what they did was a food questionnaire, and they followed patients for an average of about a decade, 9 to 10 years. And they looked at not only mortality, but also major cardiovascular events, right? MACE, we talked about that in prior podcasts. Cardiovascular causes, non-fatal MIs, stroke, heart failure, etc. And so then they looked at hazard ratios. And I'm not going to bore you with as many details because, again, you get the same problems, where if you look at the raw data doesn't show any difference. Oh, and they broke it down not just by all carbohydrate intake, but carbohydrate intake, whole grains, refined grains, and white rice. And nice to know, white rice, no association at all with increased rates of heart disease or death from cardiovascular events or major adverse cardiac events. No issues with MACE, no issues with mortality. And not surprisingly, whole grains also, again, not associated with, increasing whole grains. So they looked at, again, quartiles, lowest intake versus highest intake. So highest intake of white rice compared to lowest intake of white rice, no differences. Lowest intake of whole grains versus highest intake of whole grains, no differences. Lowest intake of refined carbohydrates versus people that had over 7 servings of refined carbohydrates per day, the higher quartile was associated with major cardiac events and mortality. Sorry, I said quartile, I meant quintile. Ooh, big difference. Okay, so, but what does this actually mean? If you look at the raw numbers, because again, they don't randomize people when they put them on these questionnaires. They just get the questionnaires and then they put people into columns. If you actually look at the raw data, there's actually 11% of people in the lowest amount of refined carbohydrates. 11% of those patients either died or had a major cardiac event, okay, versus only 10% in the highest quintile. So again, at raw value, you look at these questionnaires and you're like, oh, wait, that was exactly the opposite of what we expected. And then they put it through all this modeling, all these statistical, finagling to randomize based on age and smoking status and yada, yada, yada. And you can go through all this stuff in the study if you want. But again, they put it through this multivariable adjustment. And then in this study, they even adjust for medications. And after all of that, yes, there is a statistically significant worsening the higher up in the more and more and more refined carbohydrates you have. And that doesn't surprise anybody, that we know that for years, that simple carbohydrates, highly refined carbohydrates are bad for you. This is nice to know that, white rice and whole grains don't carry that same risk. But again, the science here is so weak that, yes, it's nice to kind of validate us and pat us on the back to say, yeah, we knew this. But it's pretty unimpressive. And again, the number needed to harm about eating 7 servings compared to 1 serving. By the way, the lowest quintile was less than 1 serving, basically. So it was like less than 50 grams per day. And then the other one is greater than 350 grams per day in the highest quintile. So when we talk about this, right, we're going from almost no carbs to a massive amount of refined carbs. So refined carbs in both cases. And the number needed to harm is something like 34. And again, this is over a 10-year period. So is it that impactful? Sure. I mean, a number needed harm of 30 it's pretty impactful. I think that's valuable to know about. Is it meaningful? Is it actually real? Is it just a product of some of the multivariable adjustments? Yeah, kind of. Again, this is such weak data points. It's nice to know, but compared to the headlines of saying like refined carbs are going to kill you, that's true for some people, right? That is, and we see it again causing worsening outcomes in terms of increased rates of diabetes and obesity, etc. But when you actually pair into the data, it's not that impressive. But still, lower refined carbs, the better. I think every single doctor at this point probably agrees with that. To any extent, doesn't matter how bad the science is. There's still enough data points to show it's real. So, anyways, again, we're talking about dietary stuff today. Hopefully this was a nice dive into a couple of papers just to kind of review some stuff, to have, talking points to talk with patients and do some education. I sure like diving into these dietary studies because they're all terrible studies, and even the best ones that get published are still pretty garbage. So that makes the headlines anyway, so I thought we should talk about it. Again, you don't need to stay up all night to stay up to date. This has been Dr. Mark List. Thanks for tuning in again this week, and have a great week. Bye.